There were 14 of them, and they were in uniform, and they were standing on my mother's front lawn on a Sunday afternoon in October. And my Uncle Gerald, who had called my husband a coward at a family dinner 8 months earlier, was standing at the door with a plate of food in his hand because we had been mid-meal when the knock came, and he opened the door, and he looked at 14 soldiers standing in formation on the lawn, and the plate tilted in his hand, and a bread roll fell off and landed on the porch, and nobody picked it up, and the man at the front of the group said, "Good afternoon, sir. We're looking for Elena Marsh," and my uncle looked back into the house at me, and I put my napkin on the table, and I stood up, and I walked to the door, and I said, "I'm Elena," and the man said, "Ma'am, we heard about what happened at the deployment ceremony, and we wanted to come ourselves," and I said, "Thank you." And he said, "Your husband is one of the best men any of us have ever served with." And he said we thought his family should know that from us directly. And I looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the bread roll on the porch and the plate in his hand, and he did not say anything, and I said, "Please come in," and 14 soldiers came into my mother's house and sat at her table, and my Uncle Gerald did not call my husband a coward again for the rest of his life. Hey everyone, welcome back. And if you are new here today, of all the stories to start with, this is a good one. I promise you that. I'm Elena Marsh, and I am 34 years old, and my husband James has been in the military for 11 years. And for 11 years, my family has had opinions about that, and opinions about James specifically. And the opinions have been delivered at family dinners and holiday gatherings and Sunday lunches with the specific confidence of people who have never had to defend anything harder than a parking spot. And I have sat through those opinions for 11 years because James asked me to, and because James is the kind of person who believes that other people's limitations are not worth his energy. And I had agreed with that philosophy right up until the deployment ceremony in February, when my Uncle Gerald looked at my husband in his uniform and said in front of 30 people that any man who chooses to leave his family for a war that has nothing to do with him is either a coward or a fool. And James had stood there and said nothing, and I had stood there and said nothing, and we had driven home in silence, and James had shipped out 4 days later, and I had sat in our house alone and thought about what Gerald had said, and thought about who James was, and understood that those two things could not exist in the same world without one of them eventually being corrected. My husband James is not a man who talks about what he does, and I want to say that first, because it is the most important thing about him, and it is also the thing that had given my family space to construct their own version of him, which was small and uninformed and wrong, and the version they had constructed went like this. James was quiet, which my Aunt Patrice had decided meant he had nothing to say, and James did not discuss his service, which my Uncle Gerald had decided meant there was nothing worth discussing, and James had declined 2 family hunting trips, which Gerald had decided meant he was soft, and James had once left a family barbecue early without detailed explanation, which Gerald had decided meant he was rude, and from these 4 data points, Gerald had built a portrait of my husband that he had been sharing at family gatherings for 3 years, and the portrait was of a man who was lesser, and the word coward at the deployment ceremony was just the portrait, finally, being spoken out loud, and what Gerald did not know, and what I had never told him, was why James had left the barbecue early, which was that he had received a call that one of his unit members had been injured, and he had gone to the hospital, and sat with that man's wife for 4 hours until the surgery was finished. And what Gerald did not know was that James had declined the hunting trips, because both times he had been in mandatory pre-deployment preparation that he was not permitted to discuss. And what Gerald did not know was that the quiet he had interpreted as emptiness was the quiet of a man who had seen things that do not survive being turned into dinner table conversation. And I knew all of this, and I had kept all of it because James had asked me to, and because I had believed that people who build portraits of others from ignorance do not generally respond to information they did not ask for, and I had been right about that, and I had also been waiting without knowing I was waiting for the moment when the information would arrive in a form that could not be declined. James shipped out in February, and I spent the spring getting through the days the way military spouses get through deployments, which is one task at a time, and I went to the family gatherings because my mother asked me to, and I sat at the tables. And I listened to Gerald say things like, well, at least he's somewhere doing something, and I listened to my Aunt Patrice say, I just worry about you being alone so much, and I smiled, and I passed the bread basket, and I drove home, and I did not say anything. And in May, James called me from overseas, and he sounded tired in the specific way he sounds when something has happened that he cannot tell me about. And he said, "I'm okay." And I said, "I know." And he said, "How's the family?" And I said, "Gerald came to Sunday lunch," and James laughed and said, "What did he say this time?" And I said the usual, and James said, "Elena, I need you to do something for me," and I said anything. And he said, "When I get back, I want to do something for the guys in my unit. And I want to do it at your mother's house if she'll have us." And I said, "Of course she will." And he said, "A Sunday lunch if she's willing." And I said, "James, my mother will cook for an army." And he said, "That's actually what I'm asking." And I said, "I know." And I said, "Consider it done." And I called my mother that same evening, and my mother said, "Absolutely." And I called my mother-in-law, and she drove 4 hours to help cook. And I did not tell Gerald, and I did not tell Patrice, and I did not tell anyone in my family except my mother what was coming. And I set the date for the Sunday after James's return. And I told my family it was a welcome home lunch, and I told them nothing else. James came home on a Thursday, and I picked him up, and we had 2 days alone. And on the third day, he called his unit, and on Sunday morning, 14 men arrived at my mother's house, and my mother and James's mother had been cooking since 6 a.m. And the table was extended into the hallway, and there were chairs from 3 different rooms. And at 12:30, my family began arriving, and Gerald arrived at 12:45 with his wife, and he shook James's hand and said, "Welcome back, son." And James said, "Thank you, Gerald," and Gerald said, "Glad you made it home safe," and James said, "Thank you." And Gerald went inside and helped himself to food, and at 1 p.m. we were mid-meal when the knock came, and Gerald was closest to the door, and he opened it, and there were 14 soldiers in uniform on the lawn in formation, and the plate tilted, and the bread roll fell, and nobody picked it up, and the man at the front said they were looking for Elena Marsh, and I walked to the door, and he told me they had heard about what was said at the deployment ceremony, and they had wanted to come themselves. And then he said something that I am going to tell you exactly, because I have replayed it every day since, and he said, "Ma'am, your husband carried 2 men out of a situation that none of us are going to forget." And he said he did it without being asked, and without hesitation, and he said, "We don't think his family knows the kind of man they have, and we thought they should hear it from the people who were there," and Gerald was standing 2 feet behind me, and I did not turn around, and I said, "Please come in," and they came in, and they sat at the table, and my mother fed 14 soldiers, and James sat at the head of the table, and, said almost nothing because that is who James is, and Gerald sat at the far end and said almost nothing, because for the first time in 3 years, he did not have a portrait to offer. And after lunch, one of the soldiers shook Gerald's hand at the door and said, "Your nephew by marriage is the reason 3 of us went home to our families." And Gerald said, "I didn't know." And the soldier said, "No, sir." And he said, "That's why we came." And Gerald looked at James across the room, and James was helping my mother clear plates, and Gerald said he never told us, and the soldier said, "No, sir, he wouldn't," and that's exactly the point. I did not plan that Sunday as revenge, and I want to be honest about that, because the honest version is that James asked for a lunch for his unit, and I said yes, and I did not invite Gerald as a trap. I invited Gerald because he is family, and family comes to welcome home lunches, and what I planned was a meal, and what arrived was the truth, and the truth had been there the whole time. It had just been waiting for the right Sunday, and the right 14 people to carry it through the door, and Gerald has not said anything dismissive about James since that afternoon, and at Christmas he shook James's hand for a long time and did not say anything, and James nodded, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. And I think about the bread roll on the porch sometimes, and I think about the plate tilting in Gerald's hand, and I think that is the exact image of a portrait dropping, and I am glad I was there to see it, and I am glad James never knew I had been waiting for it. Because James would have said it wasn't necessary, and he would have been technically right and completely wrong at the same time.